Many see progress and environmental protection as competing priorities, where one must always be chosen over the other. At ELOS, we see things differently. We see a partnership, a balance between improving the quality of our lives and preserving the places we call home. Our services make it possible for projects to move forward while also ensuring that they comply with all laws and regulations, that sensitive wetlands are not damaged or destroyed, that endangered species and habitats are protected, and that invaluable cultural resources are preserved for future generations. This is where we live, where we play, where we raise our families. We strive for a brighter future, but remain committed to the lands we love. ELOS, where natural environments and human interests intersect.
Good afternoon. Thank you for joining us today. Appreciate your time. Happy to have you as we explore environmental permits for construction projects. My name is Bud Faust. I am the marketing coordinator here at ELOS Environmental. Just a couple of housekeeping items before we begin. First of all, the presentation is being recorded and will be available for replay on our YouTube channel. You will be notified via email when that is up on our YouTube channel. Please feel free to share with colleagues or anyone you think might be interested. Definitely appreciate that. The other thing is that we will be taking questions, but only at the end of the presentation. We'll be using the chat function for entering questions. You can enter a question at any time during the presentation, but again, we won't be addressing the questions until the end of the presentation. One last thing, some of you are attending for continuing professional development credit. For those who are, you will be receiving your certificate of attendance before the end of next week. My contact information is in the chat box. If you have any questions relative to your certificate or your credit hour, please feel free to reach out to me. Again, thank you for joining us. We very much appreciate it. And with that, I will turn you over to our presenters.
So good afternoon. I think many of you are familiar with ELOS, but just in case, I thought I'd give a little bit of an introduction to our company. We are founded in 2006 as a professional consulting company, offering really a wide range of specifically environmental work. We're a part now of Aventia, along with BM Systems, Saint Germain, Habitat Management, and Casey Harvey. We have always had a pretty strong footprint in the state of Louisiana. I've been doing this for about 20 years. Part of our strength is our familiarity with the agencies, with federal, state, and local agencies and their processes. But now with are being acquired by Aventia, our footprint really is expanding nationwide. So, introduce myself, Kareem Belhajali. I have over 20 years of experience in ecosystem restoration. Prior to joining ELOS 2 years ago, I worked for a number of years for state CPRA. Since joining ELOS, I've increasingly been exposed to sort of more the regulatory aspect. So, I've been on a bit of a learning journey over the past couple of years, aided by all my capable colleagues. And so I thought, it'd be interesting to, as we give this presentation, for me to give you some of my perspective on things. But really, we'll lean heavily on Brian Fortson, who's on the call as well, with his experience and sort of a mentor under him. So with that, maybe I'll let Brian introduce himself and give a little bit about his background.
Yeah, I'm Brian Fortson. I spent the first 23 years of my career as the coastal administrator and environmental manager for the parish of St. Tammany. I had a lot of interaction with infrastructure, obviously, at St. Tammany Parish, but also did my fair share of coastal restoration engagement, engaged with CPRA, stuff like that. In about 2013, I left St. Tammany Parish and hooked on with ELOS as a consultant and have been a project manager, regulatory project manager, and more recently the senior technical lead for ELOS. The predominantly what I do is regulatory in nature. I either deal with some mitigation projects for the back end of permitting, or I deal with permitting directly in innumerable contexts: infrastructure, commercial development, residential development, all of those things. However, mostly I think my involvement still sort of centers around infrastructure by and large: drainage, road, parish building type infrastructure is mostly what I spend my time doing. I have a degree from Southeastern in wetland ecology, and I have a law degree from Loyola, and that's me. I don't know what else I can say about myself. That's pretty much my career in a nutshell, and that's kind of what I do. Looking through the attendee list today, I see several people that I've worked with in the past, and I just want to say I'm happy to see you guys. If I don't know who you are, hopefully after this, we'll have an opportunity to work together at some point. But I'm really encouraged to see the participation, and really happy to see some of the people that I work with sometimes attending as well.
Okay, well, thanks for that, Brian. So we'll dive into the presentation. I will give the majority of the info. I hope Brian chimes in as needed and help augment some of the material.
I'll be the color commentator.
Color commentator, there we go. So with that, maybe let's go ahead and dive in, and let's talk a bit about permitting.
Yeah.
And we'll cover some of this in a little bit more detail as we go. But what really sort of prompted this presentation is on seeing the amount of funding that's become available through my former agency CPRA. All the work that's coming on through LWI. So we said, hey, let's give a presentation on the construction side, but also give an overview of the different type of permits as you start either through engineering design and the construction phase and the planning phase, sort of understand how all these different things come together and why you need to apply for them, and then how do you deal with them on the construction side. Environmental permits are essential for making sure that projects comply with federal, state, local regulations that are really aimed at protecting natural resources and the public health. The permits are there to help mitigate any kind of negative impacts of industrial construction, development, activities on air, land, water, wildlife, and cultural resources. So, as you can see, understanding sort of the types of permits that you might need for a project really is crucial in sort of avoiding down the line any kind of fines, project delays, or any kind of potential legal issues. So in terms of some of the common types of environmental permits you might encounter through your professional life as you're taking projects either through the planning process, the engineering design process, or the construction process, those may include things like air quality permits, where you'd reach out to LDEQ and apply for that air quality permit. A lot of that will depend on the size of the project. If you're really focused on construction project, for example, if it's a coastal restoration project, a lot of that has to do with the type of equipment that you have on site, the type of emissions you might put out, what thresholds are you reaching for that, and that could then peg you into a different size, different types of permits. On the water side, if you're working near water or you're discharging into a waterway, you may have a discharge permit, or maybe you're looking at LPDES, or either national side. And here, as we go through these through this process, there are national permits or sort of federal permits you may need to apply for, state permits and coastal permits. And in some cases, you may talk about hybrid permits. So, keep that in mind as we get down the road. You may hear something about hybrid, and we'll explain that in a little bit. But
Right. Well, and
yeah, go
also,
ahead.
I'm just going to jump in
Yep.
when I have something to say, Kareem, if that,
Yeah,
if that
no, that's
doesn't
part. I
bother you,
mean,
but
I
whatever.
kind of like the back and forth a little bit. I think it makes it a little bit more entertaining.
Right. With respect to water permits, you're typically going to have two kinds of water permits, and it will depend on your project. And things like discharge permits are typically going to be involved with uh, things and projects with a direct point source discharge, things like wastewater treatment plants and stuff like that. And those will be handled one way, and those are discharge permits. But those are only really going to be relevant with point source discharges involved in your project. The one that you will most likely see as a general practitioner, just general construction, are the MPDES, LPDES permits. Those are nationwide, and those are administered by the state water quality agency, whoever that is in your particular state. But in Louisiana, it's DEQ. And so these permits will deal more with stormwater runoff, surface water runoff. They're not going to necessarily be point sources. This is going to be sheet flow, and for most construction sites, it doesn't matter if you require a core permit or a DNR permit or local zoning or whatever, you will almost always be required to comply with some element of the MPDES, LPDES stormwater rules. Those, you may be in a municipality that handles those in lieu of DEQ. You may be of small enough site where you don't physically have any reporting requirement to DEQ, but it doesn't mean that you don't have to have documents on file at your site and have done some planning. And so for construction site, most of what you're going to see is the MPDES and LPDES stuff. And that's going to be for almost every construction site, regardless of whether you have wetland permits or not.
Yep. Thanks for that. Some other types of permits you may encounter, especially at the local zoning and planning level, are things like land use and development permits. There are wildlife and conservation permits that you may need in Louisiana through LWF, the Scenic Streams certification and permit process is something you'll may require, and we'll talk about that in a little bit further down the road. And then Section 7 of the Endangered Species Act, which again require, as you go through the permitting process, will require federal agencies to cooperate and use their authorities to conserve sort of some of the listed species. This is primarily done. Yep, go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say, with Section 7 and the threatened and endangered stuff, you may not have specific issues with regard to an endangered or threatened animal on your site, but there may be habitat features that are conducive to that particular species existing in your area. And so even though you don't have to necessarily have a Section 7 permit, it is very common in the permitting process to have endangered species conditions inserted into other permits because of what Kareem just said. They're sort of a commenting agency. They'll comment into permits. And so even though you may not need a separate Section 7 take permit, it is those provisions may well show up in your other permits as conditions, and those may have requirements for you as to what you can and can't do on site, but that will be rolled into your other permits, the more coastal and marine permits that we're about to talk about.
Yeah, and on those, I think those are the ones most of us who work in coastal Louisiana are probably most familiar with. And we'll talk about sort of, how and why you do apply for different types of permits depending on where you are with regards to the coastal zone. But a coastal use permit through which is now the Louisiana Department of Conservation and Energy is if you are in the coastal zone, that's the coastal use permit that you would need to request. Outside of the coastal zone, a core permit. So again, we'll talk about sort of the regulatory framework in a little bit, but they're different depending on where you are. Maybe you require different types of permits. You also cultural and heritage site permits are something that you may encounter as you're going through engineering design, trying to make sure that we protect cultural sites. There are conditions associated with all that. So those are again another type of permit. Emergency response disaster management permits. In some cases, in Louisiana, for example, LDEQ is the main authority that issues those emergency debris site permits. And typically those are done under the state comprehensive plan for disaster cleanup and debris management. And that's for storm debris removal, and then burn disposal site permitting, typically under the LDEQ. And there are provisions during disasters for expedited use of controlled burning. So.
Well, and also with regard to all of the above permits that we've mentioned so far, those will be or can be required for any of your storm work. But most of the agencies, the Corps and DNR, have in place specific permit processes that allow you to start working with an emergency permit. That's kind of why it's listed separately. I mean, you will have to get all of your regular permits for any kind of stream work or debris removal work that would normally require a permit. But the state and the federal government both have expedited processes through which you get your initial approval, and then you're going to do your work, and then you're going to clean up those permits after the fact or as you go. And that's kind of why it's listed separate here. It's the same agencies a lot of times, but there are going to be particular permits that are available to you after, for instance, named storms or presidential disaster declarations, things like that. Those storm debris removal permits and emergency authorizations kind of kick in at that point.
Okay. And then last, noise and light pollution permits. Not as familiar with those. Mostly those are acquired at the local level through parish or municipal level through ordinances.
And anything that is where you will see noise and light come up in addition to actual permits, you will usually see those issues come up in any kind of federal NEPA assessment, noise, light, those kinds of things. So you may not need permits on it, but if you have a federally funded project or it's a big project that the Corps has lead on, then that federal action may make you have to deal with those issues. You may not have to get a permit per se, but you will more than likely have to deal with those two issues on some level in the NEPA process. And so it's part of that is going to be binding, and part of whatever the requirements for those noise and light pollution issues are going to be binding on your permit as well. Sometimes those will come in as permit conditions, perhaps. And so, again, maybe not a standalone permit like Section 7, but you're definitely going to have situations where you run into those issues and they're going to control your construction site or your plans to some degree.
All right, so we mentioned the regulatory framework. A lot of this depends on where your activity is taking place, whether you're in the coastal zone versus non-coastal zone, where you need to apply for a state versus federal. Coastal use permit is required in Louisiana under the coastal zone. It's required for all activities that may impact wetlands, waterways, coastal resources. You want to make sure that you're in compliance with state coastal management plans. The core permit is typically a Section 10 for permit, and that really is for construction or dredging within navigable waters or wetland areas. The Section 4 permits are required under the Clean Water Act. So as you're planning and trying to figure out which route you're going to go with your permit, you will look to see, which way, where you are located. Keeping in mind that, in some case, like if you're in the coastal zone, you can file a JPA, joint permit application, and that's kind of a form of a hybrid permit where, you apply through the state, and then, it'll also go to the Corps for review as well.
Yeah, the first question that you're going to encounter in any kind of permit situation, excuse me, is where do you send your application? Who's going to be the point for your application? And in simple terms, if you are inside the Louisiana coastal zone, all of that information you are going to apply to the state of Louisiana, and that the Office of Coastal Management, which I think they're still the Office of Coastal Management. I don't know if they've changed. They may not. They may have already changed them as well. But OCM will be or their analog will be your point for the application inside the coastal zone. They will also be a information clearinghouse for all of the other agencies. So when you submit an application to DNR, DNR is going to distribute that application to all of the agencies that need to get it. Slightly different would be if you are outside of the coastal zone and you have some sort of, well, and first off, if you're below the 5-foot contour in the coastal zone, the question of wetlands or waters doesn't really enter into whether or not you're submitting an application. If you are in the coastal zone and you are anywhere around the 5-foot contour or below, you're going to submit an application. You are required to submit an application to DNR, whether there are wetlands or not. The significant difference with the federal infrastructure is that if you're not in the coastal zone, your application is only required if you impact a specific jurisdictional resource, like a water or a wetland, like Kareem said. If you are going to impact those resources, your application needs to go to the Corps of Engineers and not to the Department of Natural Resources. And so inside the coastal zone and outside the coastal zone, you have two different addresses that you're going to start your permit process off. And I realize this may be, basic information for some of y'all that y'all understand, but if you don't do it all the time, I guess the newest development in that regard is that the Corps now has an online permit submittal portal. DNR has had one for years, but it's just been recently that the Corps brought online their RRS, their online application portal. It requires more and different information than the old application did, but our hope and what we're kind of seeing is that the online application process kind of helps the flow, and so we've been using the online portal now for several months. they've been working the kinks out of it, and they're getting to where it's pretty decent at this point. So, the coastal zone versus non-coastal zone is not just the different permits in different jurisdictions, but it's a different address to send your application to, depending on where you are. And so coastal use permits, and the things that you might see coming out in coastal use permits are, first and foremost, any coastal use permit or core permit that involves wetlands is likely to involve mitigation. So both of those permits will require some mitigation discussion. But coastal use permits are more going to be focused on, for instance, hydrology impacts. With every coastal use permit, more or less, you're going to have to submit a hydrologic modification impact analysis. Coastal use permits are very concerned with how you're changing water flow on the surface. Corps of Engineers are by contrast, in federal system, they're concerned with what you're going to do to the hydrology of the system, but they're not typically as concerned about overland sheet flow drainage and impacts to the system as DNR is. That's something, DNR does not use the same definition of wetlands that the Corps uses. And so there are differences in the two permit regimes or the two permit frameworks, but they will still usually both be required, particularly in the coastal zone. You will typically run these together. The coastal use permit is either going to be processed by the parish if they have a local coastal program, or by the state if they don't, or if it involves oil and gas. If it involves anything that goes over a parish line, the state will retain those permits and they will process them. But if it's a truly local use, one of the features of the coastal use permit process is that they will farm that permit out to the local government and essentially wash their hands of it. And so you're getting a coastal use permit, but if that coastal parish has its own program, you'll be getting that coastal use permit not from DNR, but from that parish government. And so there's some, things to pay attention to, and there's a little more nuance to the coastal use permit process than there is to the Corps. A section 10404 is only going to be, or is primarily going to be concerned with what impact you are going to have on their jurisdictional features, their waterways, their wetlands. Just for background, Section 10 and 404 are two different federal statutes that both require permitting in waters. Section 10 is the Rivers and Harbors Act. Section 404 is the Clean Water Act. You do not typically see those as separate permits. They are almost always together as one permit. It is a 10404 or a 404 permit. There is not much distinction between them. The 401 water quality certification will be required anytime you need a Corps permit. The DEQ is charged with being the water quality police for our state. The water quality police for any given state get to weigh in on pending Corps permits. They do that through a water quality certification. And so if you're requiring a Corps permit, unless that water quality certification has been programmatically issued, for instance, to a nationwide permit, then you're going to have to deal again with DEQ for this 401 water quality certification. They will be very concerned with the degree to which you are going to control, for instance, sediment runoff. They want to see your best management practices. If you have to get a WQC, you're going to have a best management practice drawing. You're going to have to show them how the water flows across your site prior to the project, and then possibly after the project. And you're going to have to show DEQ how you intend to manage pollutants in that particular water system, your sheet flow water system or your drainage system. So it is part of Section 10404. 401 is a section of the Clean Water Act that says that if the Corps is going to issue a permit, the state has to sign off on it. 401 lays out the standards for what the state agency can require of you and what they need to see. And so the bottom two here go together. 401 is an element of 404, but it is separate agency and separate questions, and you will get a separate document after having completed the water quality certification stuff. But it's mandatory for any federal Clean Water Act permit that's going to get issued. Your state water quality agency gets to weigh in on it and has to certify it.
And that's all part of the clearinghouse, agency clearinghouse that you mentioned earlier, correct, Brian?
Yes, they will be automatically notified once the Corps gets it that a Corps permit is processing, and then this is a problem. It is just the way it is, but these three agencies, even though all of their processes are tied together, they don't talk to each other, not very well. And so if you need a permit from all three of them, and this is part of where we make our living, you have to keep those three agencies in coordination. The Corps is going to say, oh, you need a water quality certification, go talk to DEQ. And that's the last you're going to hear about it with the Corps until they keep asking you for it. Where's your water quality certification? You've got to go and deal with that with DEQ. And then when you do, DEQ will notify the Corps that process is solved, and then the Corps will move forward with their permitting. Coastal use and Section 10404 permitting coastal use in the Corps permit, there's actually a memorandum of agreement between those two agencies that details how they are supposed to coordinate with each other. They do not do it. And so you often are running all three agencies out of separate communications, trying to keep all these permits running together. So it is one process, but the agencies, if you're embarking on any of this, just be forewarned. The agencies do not communicate with each other with any kind of efficiency.
Okay, I teed that up, so you would have to say that, Brian, not me.
Right. Yeah, the memorandum of understanding was a 1998 MOU between the Corps and DNR. And if you ever find it and get to read it, there's a lot of stuff that they're supposed to be doing in concert that would make the process really easy. They just don't do it. And they haven't for years. They don't talk to each other. So that complicates things.
Thanks. And I think you had mentioned earlier the Endangered Species Act. We talked about that a little bit. You know, it is necessary when the projects impact federally protected species or their habitat. So something to keep in mind, just because you're may not directly be impacting the species itself, you need to also look at habitat, and that may also require habitat conservation plans, monitoring efforts as either you're going through construction or post-construction. The Scenic Rivers permit is part of the Louisiana's designated Scenic Rivers program. They want to make sure that you are not, having environmental impacts to those protected waterways.
Right, and that will be a separate application that you will submit to the Wildlife and Fisheries, and it will be processed with its own public notice. Again, it's a completely separate permit application and permit process. However, it is triggered by your other applications. They will find out about your use through the coastal use process usually, or the Corps public notice process. And so they will find out about it and you will have to deal with it. Our advice is that if you know you're on a scenic stream, start that along with everything else. Just go ahead and send them an application. You know you need it, get on it. Don't wait for those public notice processes to trigger these other permits like Section 7. I will go, like, on every permit, our guys are going to do an IPAC, and if we have to, we're going to go consult with U.S. Fish and Wildlife, possibly even before, but generally right when we submit a core application. We know they're looking at it. One of the things you don't want to do is let agencies initiate the review on their schedule. If you do that, it could be weeks before somebody at that office picks up those public notices and decides that, oh, well, you need to do something with them. The way that you get ahead of that is just you be upfront and go to those agencies on your own, and that generally will save you some time. But Scenic Rivers is its own statutory permit process, and even though it is attendant to all of the other permits, it is separate, and it will have its own separate conditions, its own separate requirements, as will all of these permits. And I guess in keeping with our theme here about construction site, where we're going to wrap all this is in conditions, in permit language, and the ways that these permits control your construction site. Any one of the permits that we've talked about, and we're going to talk about levee permits here real quick in a second too, any of these authorizations are going to come with conditions. They may not be the same conditions amongst the permits. The core permit may have different conditions than the DNR permit, than the state scenic streams permit. And that's where all of the relevant detail about what's going to happen on your construction site gets controlled. It gets controlled by the drawings that you sent in for those permits and the conditions under which those permits are authorized. Levee permits are not environmental permits. However, if you apply for a core permit, one of the groups that gets it is what we sort of loosely call the 408 group, the completed works group. Those are the people that control the levees and the intercoastal waterway and floodgates and things like that. And so if you're going to be doing anything around those kinds of facilities, you're going to have to deal with another triumvirate of agencies just to deal with the engineering that is required to site your project near these facilities. If you're going anywhere near a levee, 1,500 feet on one of your projects, levee permits are going to come in. You're going to have to go to the USACE and to CPRA and to the local levee district, and you're going to have to get authorization from all of those agencies to work within proximity of that levee. Doesn't have anything to do with environment. It's all engineering. However, you making the levee permit people happy is directly relevant to how quick you're going to get your 404 permit, because they're not going to issue the 404 permit until the levee people tell them it's okay, or until the endangered species folks over at U.S. Fish and Wildlife tell them it's okay. And so that's where this sort of comes to a head, is that when you're ready to get your 404 permit, you will find that there are these other permits that you need to have, or these other authorizations. And if you haven't started them, that's delaying your 404. Levee permits for us are a big one. We have a lot of work along the Mississippi River or around the intercoastal waterway, or even as simple as local rivers that the Corps has dredge authority on, like the Chafuncta River mouth or something like that. If you want to do anything out there, you got to clear that with the Corps levee people and the Corps completed works people. And that's going to have a whole nother set of conditions. The levee permits are going to tell you when you have to stop work. If you're working around a levee and the river hits 11 on the Carrollton gauge, that one of the conditions of your levee permit is you seal your site, move all the equipment, and you wait until the river goes down before you do any work. That's just a condition in your permit. If you don't read it and adhere to it, you possibly are going to have some real big problems coming, because now you're working in a moratorium area on a high river next to a levee, and that's anathema to the Corps. Anybody just go back and look at the 17th Street Canal in 2005, and we'll see why they get really nervous when you work around levees.
And what's the entry portal for that levy permit? Is it through the JPA directly, or is it a separate permit that you have to apply for?
If I know I need one, I'm treating it as a separate application. I am preparing a request to all three of those listed agencies, and I'm sending it out, and I'm letting them tell me. I am not waiting for the 404 shop to tell the completed workshop that there's a pending permit. I'm going to try, just like those other ones, I'm trying to get this review underway as quickly as possible so that if there are issues, I'm not holding up my core permit.
That's great. So let's talk about a little bit some of the specific site conditions, requirements. I think, probably most of you are familiar with the SWIP. And again, that's really trying to protect water quality. It's erosion sediment controls you'd put together. And a lot of them require best management practices, such as sediment fences, sediment basins, vegetative buffers. On the cultural resource side, you have to, perform an assessment for historical or archaeological sites. The goal there is to try to avoid destruction of cultural artifacts. With that, you may be dealing with a different agency and coordinating with SHPO, the State Historic Preservation Offices. On your construction site, drainage plans, we talked about that a little bit earlier. I think when you're looking at use states and coastal use permits, your figures and documents, you have to review those, read them, and understand that, they do, you are going to have requirements during construction as part of that. And then finally, like implementing measures to minimize environmental impacts, on-site avoidances and mitigation. So,
Right.
Yep.
So your stormwater pollution prevention plan, I mentioned a little earlier under the LPDES and NPDES requirements, and those general permits, virtually all of them require a SWIP. And in that SWIP, they will want to see the direction of flow of water across your site. They typically don't have any particular storm design that they're looking at. They just want to see what generally the contours are going to do to the water. And they want to ensure that you are putting in place sufficient measures to keep any pollutant, and typically this is going to be sediment pollution because you're talking about a disturbed site. And so primarily that's what we're talking about in stormwater pollution prevention plans is sediment. You're going to see things like wheel washes. I have lots of projects where the stormwater pollution prevention plan is going to call for a 50-foot wide section of driveway with 4 to 6 inch cobble size bed of stone 1.5 feet deep, and it needs to be in a particular location because all the trucks need to drive through it to knock the mud off of their wheels before they get out on the highway. You will see some fuel issues, like if you've got storage tanks, let's say you're working on a big old project and you're going to bring a couple of 1,000-gallon tanks of diesel out there to store it. You're going to have to deal with your runoff issues with that diesel tank. You're going to have containment, obviously, so that if somebody drives by and punctures a hole in it, it doesn't just flow out all over the ground. Things like that. And that's all going to come from that LPDES, NPDES system. And these are permits that, and the reason that they're important is because you can't just draw up your SWIP, put it in the work trailer, and then go on. If somebody comes out to the site, and DEQ can and doesn't do this very often, but if somebody calls and there's an issue, you better have that SWIP on site, and you better be doing on your construction site what that SWIP says you're supposed to do. And very often that SWIP is taken, the engineer gives it to them, they stick it up on the shelf of the work trailer, and that's the last time anybody sees it. And if DEQ gets a call or something, they come out there, they want a seat. When's the last time you inspected your BMPs? Are these BMPs the way that you drew them out? And so nobody's checking you, but you got to do it, because if they do come check you, they could stop work. It could be a problem. Cultural resource avoidance, generally this is not that big a deal, but I have had projects where the cultural guys have identified a potential area. In order to ameliorate the agency's request, we've agreed, for instance, to stay out of that area. Your construction guys need to know you made that agreement. If you made that agreement to get your permit, you better go flag it so that something doesn't happen in that area when you're not on the site or your construction manager's not on the site. The worst violations that I have ever seen have come from just regular guys on a track machine or a bulldozer that just weren't told not to do something. I mean, I've gotten horrible, horrible enforcement issues over just letting the track guy go. And then 3 hours later, the track guy has you in a federal violation. Like, you got to control the equipment, guys, and everybody on the equipment needs to know what the conditions and provisions of that permit are, what the permit drawings say. The permit drawings will have the area in which you're authorized to work. If you're going to go do something outside of that, you're running a risk, because perhaps that was not reviewed. That area over there aside on the south side of your staging area, nobody did a JD there, nobody did a cultural resource exercise there. That was not within the project footprint, but all of a sudden you want to go out there and do it. Not that you can't, but there's a risk because none of that stuff has been cleared. And so if your equipment guy decides that he's just going to go and stage all these culverts out there on that next driveway down, you may run afoul of your plan. And so it's very, very critically important that everybody on the site who is turning dirt has seen those permit drawings and has read the permit conditions. You may have a particular area that in the permit there, and this doesn't happen all the time, but it happens often enough that, you go to lay out your project and everything, and in your permit, there were a lot of wetlands, and you got a permit to fill those wetlands, except that in your permit, you said that one over there is going to stay. We're avoiding that wetland, and we're going to not go in that particular wetland. Again, turn your guy loose on the bulldozer, go to lunch, come back, see what he's done. And if he's gone into that area that you were supposed to avoid, now you've got a problem because you didn't pay mitigation for that. That area was not considered in your permit. And so probably the biggest thing that you can do on your construction site is just control the people who are working on it and make sure that everybody knows what conditions you have in these permits. Violating them temporarily, changing stuff in the field, everybody knows that happens, right? And nobody's coming to put you in jail for this kind of stuff. But the danger is really that they'll stop the work. I mean, in our world, that's worse than a fine. I don't care. If you fine me, I'll pay the fine and keep going sometimes, or my clients will. But if you stop my job and give me a stop work order, and now I have $1 million a day in construction equipment that's just sitting there, then you got a problem. And so you don't want to get into these bureaucratic issues. And so the one piece of advice, I could sum up this whole presentation in one sentence, and it is read your permits. Like, that's the most important thing, because there will be conditions in all of them that you may not expect, but they'll be relevant to the stuff that you're doing on the ground. Some of these permits will require you to notify an agency when you start, particularly DNR. More of them will require you to notify them when you're done. The bookend those dates. Your authorization is for a particular thing. It'll be for a particular term, the expiration term on your permit, but they still will sometimes want to know when those dates are. Obviously, if you're dealing with Endangered Species Act or historic preservation, if your bulldozer guy turns over a human femur on your job site, just know, stop work. Call the SHPO. If you discover, I don't know, a whooping crane or a red cockaded woodpecker living in a tree on your site, you got to call them. You can't just go cut that tree down with the red cockaded woodpecker. That's an actual take, and that's a problem. So discoveries during construction, you got to stop and notify these agencies if some of these relevant things happen, because endangered species and historic preservation may have assumed that there's no problems. But if it shows up, you got to deal with it. And so, just be aware that if something shows up, you got to stop and deal with it at that point. If you sell your project gets sold in the middle of construction, that's usually a non-issue. Most of these permits transfer them with a signature. Core permit is transferred with a signature. It's easy. And so there's not so much to have to worry about when projects change hands and stuff like that. But almost, I'm not going to try and throw a statistic out. I will just say the overwhelming majority, and this is another very, very important thing, the overwhelming majority of enforcement actions are generated by aggrieved neighbors. Do not get outside of your project onto somebody else's property inadvertently. It's going to be bad enough if your neighbor didn't get your neighbor. Here's a big problem. Is a bunch of people hear a plant is coming. They all want to sell their property to the plant. Well, the plant picks two pieces of property and they buy those property and they start. Well, the guy next door, he's pissed. He's upset that his property did not get bought for the refinery. Guess what he's going to do? He's going to sit on his porch with binoculars and watch everything that happens. And every time somebody crosses a line, he's going to call the Corps or he's going to call DEQ. And that's where the enforcement actions come from, is somebody next door calls the agencies and complains. The best way to do that, one, is to avoid impacts to your neighbors. But two, see if you can get them in your fold. Make friends with them. Bring them a turkey at Christmas, whatever it is. Go sit and have a beer with them on their porch. But that's a very big part of how projects get stopped and how projects get wrapped up in enforcement actions, is there's an angry neighbor who doesn't want that project to go forward, and he is going to call every time he sees something. So it's not a prominent part of anybody's lesson on permits, but I'm going to tell you, it's probably one of the most important things you can do in your project, is to try and make nice with the neighbors. So changes in your permit to your drawings, and I alluded to this a minute ago. If you're working and you got to move a pipe 10 feet over, that kind of thing you can do. Notify the agencies afterwards, but you are afforded some flexibility on the fly in your construction. You don't have to stop anytime you need to change things. But if anything that you're going to change matters, like I wouldn't just change a 12-inch culvert to a 36-inch arch. That might be something we need to talk to somebody about, particularly if there was an HMIA done. So just be real cognizant of, you can make some changes in the field, but not major ones. But you do have some flexibility to move around and change some things in the field and notify those agencies after the fact. Levee conditions, we talked about those a little bit. those are going to be more engineering related. Special habitat avoidance. All I'll say about this is I've had some projects that had nesting bird colonies in the area. It was a requirement for us to go monitor those during construction. You may have something like that, and that will be found in your permit conditions. They will say, hey, that rookery over there by your project site, you need to have somebody inspect it every day to make sure that birds are nesting normally, or that, there are actually times where you have to do affirmative work to keep them from nesting during your construction. So, but that doesn't come up too terribly often. But that is part that will be in your permit conditions, and it will control what you do on the ground.
Yeah, that's great. So I think Brian, I think you alluded to a lot of the best practices to try to avoid issues. I'm hearing communication with the agencies, communication with the stakeholders, making sure that everyone's aware of the work that's ongoing, so that they don't pick up the phone and call in. And then I'm hearing a lot about training, using making sure that everyone on the project, whether it's the PMs, the engineers, down to the equipment operators, are aware of all these permit conditions, and that you sort of lay out for them where they need to be. You need to stake out sort of the areas ahead of time, and use your tailgates and your safety tailgates to again pass on all these permit conditions and make sure that everyone from top to bottom are aware of some of these issues. I guess maybe to wrap up, any other, I think we talked a little bit about staging areas, and sort of equipment use, everything that you're permitted for. Can you talk a little bit about staging areas and their importance, and sort of making sure that people stick to their permit conditions and are in compliance with their permits? Sorry. Okay. So I think, yeah, I mean, I think for the staging areas, it's part of your permit, it's part of your condition. There's an opportunity there to use it to make sure that you stay within compliance. It's a good place to do your tailgates. It's a good place to educate anyone and train anyone who's coming onto the site to make sure that they are aware of the permit conditions. And it's also a good place to make sure that, for example, the equipment that you're using is and matches what you had in your permit,
Right.
and all that. So
yeah,
So I
and
think-
staging area is part of it's part of your project. And so if you set one or two culverts on the grass, that's not a big deal. But if you're storing piles of equipment and stuff like that, then that's an impact to the ground. And so your staging areas are definitely part of your project and need to be considered.
yep. Okay.
All right, with our last couple minutes, we'll go ahead and open it up for any questions. If you have a question, feel free to type it into the chat box right now, and we'll get it answered for you. While I'm waiting to see if we have any questions, just a reminder that the presentation has been recorded and will be made available on our YouTube channel. In the next few days, you will receive notification when that is available. Please note, on a side note, that if watching a replay on YouTube does not qualify for professional development credit. Wish it did, because that would get us more views, but it doesn't. I'm not seeing any questions being typed into the chat box. I'll give it another minute.
Oh,
Let's see. We do have something. Can you talk about making determinations on when you need to consult with agencies, relying on sources for wetlands data, etc.?
if you are going to have a project that involves a federally protected resource, you need a permit. Waters, wetlands. Now, there's an interesting thing that we didn't really talk about here, but there are nationwide permits below certain thresholds. You don't even need to tell the agencies that you're out there. That's a whole discussion for another point. But if you're dealing with a nationwide 18, there's going to be a threshold with fill volume and stuff like that, that if you're below that, you don't even need to call the Corps if you're not in the coastal zone. And so you have a permit and you have conditions. There are lots of conditions to that permit, but you didn't have to send anything to the Corps. That permit exists nationwide. In those cases, you need to get a copy of that permit, that nationwide permit, and understand those conditions. As far as, I don't know if I understand the data source question, maybe clarify that a little bit and I'll see if I can answer it. But if you're in a federal resource, if you're wetlands, waters, and you are within the federal government's jurisdiction, then the Clean Water Act will typically require you to get some level of permitting. If that water is navigable, then Section 10 will kick in, and that will also require the permit. And so if it's a navigable water, you're basically under both of those statutes. If it is a non-navigable, non-tidal water, you're only dealing with 404 in that case.
All right, let's see. We do have a follow-up.
The wetlands mapper. Yeah, I'd go in the field, do a wetland delineation. I would not trust anybody's, like, we used to see a lot of projects come in and people would submit, for instance, the printout of the NWI page, National Wetland Inventory. That's not worth the paper it's printed on. It was a 1990s effort of just U.S. Fish and Wildlife trying to anticipate where we might have wetlands. That's not a data source to use for regulatory. An actual delineation is what you use. Like, that's, you go out and you take the data and you provide the data to the Corps, and that's how jurisdiction is established.
All right. Do we have any other questions? While we're waiting, want to remind you that this is a monthly series of webinars that we do provide. Not all are for continuing professional development hours, but we do have monthly webinars. You can follow our LinkedIn page, and be kept up to date on any upcoming topics. And also, very importantly, if there are any topics you would like us to cover, things you'd like more information on, or you feel would be beneficial to you, please reach out and let us know. We'd love to get your feedback. We'd love to, tailor something specifically for a specific need that might be out there.
Right. And Murillo, if you want to call me and continue that conversation about that, feel free.
Absolutely.
I want to say that because there's plenty of conversation we could have in that regard. So if you feel like making a phone call or whatever at some point, feel free to do so, and we can have that conversation.
Absolutely. I'm not seeing any other questions. So without any additional questions, I will again thank you very, very much for spending your time with us today. We certainly hope you found this to be informational and helpful for you in projects going forward. At the top of the chat box, I have email addresses for both of our presenters. If you have any questions you think of later or tomorrow or next week, feel free to email Brian or Karine, and they would be more than happy to address your question and get back to you with an answer. Mm-hmm. So again, I'm not seeing any additional questions in the chat box. So with that, I will wish you a great rest of your day and rest of your week. thank you again, and we hope to see you next time.
And Merry Christmas.
Thank you. Merry Christmas.
All right.